These are flags that I would have never imagined or thought about until I started making them.
That's what someone would have seen approaching these ships hundreds of years ago. It's amazing.
And that one is 280 feet of stitching and about 20,000 stitches. So that's a lot of stitches.
I had no idea that this would bring me so much joy. But seeing that I made something so much bigger than myself was so exciting.
So one of the things that I found really interesting about the making of these two flags was the amount of piecing that we did to create them in a way that was similar in practice to how they would have made them in the 18th century. So we're taking pieces of fabric and joining them together to make a larger piece. We did not do as much piecing as they did in the 18th century. Some of the originals that we've looked at have tons of little pieces all put together like a quilt to make a section. But we did it, every so often so that we sort of would nod to that.
I took all the pieces and I measured them, and so I created an Illustrator document big enough to cover or to encompass this entire flag. So I created a document that I worked with on my little laptop that was 7.5 by 10.5 feet. So I'm like designing a rim-size rug on a laptop screen and taking each little piece, including its seam allowance, and then marking its seam allowance, and then moving them around to see where they go and how they go. I tended to really compartmentalize as I was going. I took the flag, I was like, how do I understand this? It is a set of essentially, because of the pieces I was given, 3 parts. So there's the canton, the top of the field, and the bottom of the field. So I saw those as 3 units that needed to be assembled. And then in order to understand them, I had to draw them. So I start by drawing. And I would just like to point out that it took me a long time to realize these crosses don't match. This was agonizing.
First, I stitched it from one side with little whip stitches. Then I flipped the flag over and I stitched an equal looking piece from the other side. So it perfectly filled in that empty space where there wasn't enough textile originally to keep the design. And I was concerned that you would be able to see this patch from a distance and it would ruin the opacity in that section. It would be so obvious, but it turns out it's not. And I think that's one of the amazing things about these projects. And that was truly the challenge of the Spanish ensign, was figuring out how all the pieces went together and trying to visualize what the order of operations would be. And this is something that fascinates me so much about people who sewed in a time before they could just go to FIT or some fancy fashion design school, is they were learning all these techniques, all of the geometry, all the hand sewing, without any kind of formal education, and they still understood the processes.
I have some numbers that I put together. So on the French ensign, which is the one that I showed you that's entirely white, I estimated that we're doing about 6 stitches per inch. So it's 120 feet of stitching, believe it or not, in that flag. Because of all the panels and on the flat felt seams, of course, you have to do them twice. So you're stitching all the way down. And then, as I said, you're coming back to finish the seam. So 120 feet, that comes out to about 8,400 stitches. That's the French one. And then I did that one first. And then I moved on to the US ensign, and that one is 280 feet of stitching.
So as part of this project for me, it was as much about the sewing as it was about trying to imagine what it was like for these women in the past. What was their space like? What was their everyday life like? What was their work day like?
And for the first time ever, honestly, my hand was starting to not like ache terribly, but be like, it would sort of by the end of the evening, if I was stitching in the evening, it would be like, my hand is kind of a little bit tender. So I was getting a little bit nervous about that. I thought, what if I can't finish? But it actually was fine.
Inevitably, you have to think about how these textiles work and how much time we spent trying to deal with the modern implications of the textile choices and what was available, because I know I spent a lot of time shoring up edges, and I was thinking, man, this takes forever to make these. I just feel so slow. I am a fast stitcher. And I felt like I was spending hour after hour just trying to running stitch my way down the edges of this thing.
You probably couldn't tell that I unpicked at least 2 seams and restitched it. And that's really all that matters. But it was an interesting exercise in observing the way that people make things, how they think things through. I like to create chunks and sequences, and finding out that, I mean, the cliched way to say it would be that all this modern technology, won't tell you the truth, right? But finding out that my hand will affect changes into the material that my computer program is not designed to compensate for. So the warmth of my hand as I work the wool and it becomes pliable, and then I have to tug it back because I'm getting tense, those variations in the organic materials in this organic maker just aren't accounted for in a nice, precise drawing where the measurements don't change.
Looking at all the flags on display in the museum, you can't really capture with your eyes all of the pieces that go into these, all of the ways that the stripes are pieced together from little pieces of material, or even a little secret patch in the center of a flag. It kind of just blends in, and your eyes read it as one solid unit. And it's just so amazing to see that. That's what someone would have seen approaching these ships hundreds of years ago. It's amazing.
The fact that I was doing this in my home, where I have a studio set up, it's really large and really nice, but it is not meant to deal with something that is 40 foot long, that is the length of my house.
One of the reasons that I ended up measuring all the pieces and putting them into Illustrator was because I had no floor space.
I unrolled the fabric, and it actually turns out that the pendant that I was working on stretched from one end of my New York City apartment to the other.
So the second learning curve that I had really was to just find enough space to create the flag.
So thankfully, because I was in the middle of a move, I didn't have any furniture in my living room kitchen area, and the flag occupied the entire floor space. It was bigger than the area rug that I had in the space.
I rolled it out at one point and I had to veer around the furniture in order to actually lay the whole thing out. I don't have a 40-foot expanse anywhere. I don't think most people do.
Just getting my hands on this project and just being able to, channel all of the sewers from the past. Like the entire time I'm sewing this thing, I'm thinking, wow, now I know what Betsy Ross must have felt when sewing this flag. This, it really is an honor, to be very honest. It is a big honor.
These are flags that I would have never imagined or thought about until I started making them. So just, how many flags are like that in the world that came and went, served their purpose, served their country, and then went.
These flags are completely hand-sewn, no sewing machines involved. And the reason we're doing that is because that's the way they were made in the 18th century. The sewing machine hadn't even been invented yet until the 19th century. And it just put me in the mind of how many women and men, in fact, have been sewing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And both the wonder of it, but also the sort of monotony of it.
When making the American flag, it definitely puts a lot of perspective, a lot of things into perspective. Case in point, as a Black woman, I'm actually sewing the American flag. Whereas back in the 18th century, you don't really hear things about that at all. Even though we hear a lot about Betsy Ross sewing the American flag and maybe a couple of the seamstresses, you don't hear that maybe another Black woman or who was either enslaved or free helping on with the project. So and not only that, but just how much time and blood, sweat, and tears that you actually put into making the flag and the design, and it took a lot of work. Putting all of that into what really makes this flag, our flag, is just the passion. And it's just, I can't even think of anything else. It's just, just emotional. So it's a little bit bittersweet that, I finished this project, but it really made me think heavily about, not only just think, but just reflect on how this flag was made.
So I think a lot of Americans right now, myself included, are frustrated with the country for multiple different reasons. So in the making of the American flag for me, and then for everyone watching me do this, it raises a lot of questions and kind of forces everybody to think critically and be curious and start. It's a conversation starter, 100%.
I was so goal focused in creating this flag that I didn't realize how purely gleeful I was going to feel when it was done. And I have never finished something and been so excited and so happy and so delighted. Imperfections, I will come and point them all out to you, but I had no idea that this would bring me so much joy. But seeing that I made something so much bigger than myself was so exciting.
And I think I'd like to close with this. I had posted an up close of a seam that I just love the way that sort of the intersection of all the little stitches and the seams come together. And I posted some, I called it imperfect perfection. And that's really the way I kind of think about it. If you look at the stitches, if you really look at them, you see they're not all exactly the same length. They're not at all perfectly straight. But when you just sort of step back slightly, they look amazing and wonderful. And so I think that's what I really, really love about the hand stitching, is that imperfect perfection.